Imagine your father has just died. You approach a teacher you have decided to follow. You tell him you are ready, but you need to go home first, just long enough to bury your father. It is not a complicated request. It is not selfish. It is the most universally human obligation that exists. And the teacher looks at you and says, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." No compassion, no softening, no explanation. If that feels wrong to you, good, because that discomfort may be the beginning of actually understanding what he meant. This verse has been sitting inside the Gospel of Matthew for 2,000 years. Most people who encounter it do one of two things. They explain it away, or they quietly move past it. Because the verse is deeply uncomfortable if you let it land. It does not fit the image of the compassionate healer who wept at a tomb. It does not fit the image of the teacher who stopped for the overlooked and the outcast. It sounds, on the surface, like something a cold and indifferent person would say. Yet few people stop and ask the question the verse is actually demanding. What kind of teacher says something like this? And what was he actually pointing at? Because if you look at the sentence carefully enough, something strange begins to surface. Something that most readings completely miss. Start with the logic of the words themselves. Dead people cannot bury anyone. A corpse has no hands, no strength, no capacity to lift or carry or lower a body into the ground. So if Jesus meant physically dead people when he used the word dead the first time, the sentence becomes immediate nonsense. It simply does not function, which means the only way the sentence can carry any meaning at all is if the word dead is doing two different things in the same breath. One person is physically dead. The other group is breathing, walking, speaking, and yet somehow also dead. Alive in the biological sense, dead in some other sense entirely. But this is where things become stranger. Because what kind of death leaves a person standing upright? And what does it mean that Jesus apparently saw this condition in the people around him, not as an edge case, but as something widespread enough to name plainly? For centuries, this verse was read primarily as a statement about priorities. Jesus matters more than family obligations. Discipleship demands sacrifice. Follow now, not later. And that reading is not entirely wrong, but it stops far too early. It treats the surface of the sentence as the destination. Yet almost nobody notices what the sentence is doing beneath the surface. It is not simply a statement about urgency. It is a description of a condition that the people left behind to bury the Father were already living inside. A condition that Jesus apparently considered a form of death, not metaphorical death, not poetic death, a real and recognizable condition described plainly to a real person in broad daylight. And that changes the weight of the verse completely. What if the death Jesus was describing was not the absence of breath, but the absence of awareness? What if he was pointing toward a condition in which a person moves through an entire life without ever genuinely waking up inside it? Functioning, productive, socially normal, yet operating almost entirely from inherited patterns, absorbed fears, and unexamined assumptions. Living not from the inside of their own life, but from the outside, from the expectations and scripts and identities that were handed to them before they were old enough to question any of it. This is not a comfortable idea, because it means the condition he was describing is not rare. It is not reserved for the obviously lost or the obviously asleep. It may be the most common condition there is. For centuries, mystics and philosophers and teachers across every tradition kept circling this same idea, not because they read the same texts, but because they kept encountering the same thing when they looked honestly at how people actually live. Heraclitus, 5 centuries before Jesus, wrote that most people move through the world as though they are asleep, each sealed inside their own private dream, unaware of the deeper reality surrounding them. The Egyptian initiatory traditions described the uninitiated as people who had not yet woken up, not wicked, not condemned, simply asleep in the deepest sense of the word. The Sufi teachers spoke of a condition called ghafla, a profound inattention, a habitual absence from one's own inner life, so ordinary it felt like simply being human. The Gnostic writings described a deep forgetting, a state in which a person has lost contact with what they actually are and moves through life mistaking the surface of things for the whole of reality. The names change, the traditions change, but the description remains almost identical across every century and every culture that looked honestly at this question. A person can be alive and not be awake. A person can have a pulse and still never truly live. And what makes this genuinely unsettling is that the condition feels, from the inside, completely normal. Yet few people notice how precisely Jesus embedded this idea into the texture of his other teachings. It is not just this verse. It is everywhere, once you begin to look for it. He speaks of eyes that are present but cannot see. He speaks of ears that hear words but never receive their meaning. He speaks of being born again, not into a different body, but into a fundamentally different quality of awareness. He speaks of people who are alive in the ordinary sense and yet remain entirely outside the kingdom. He speaks of the living searching for something that is already within them and not finding it. Again and again, across different conversations and different parables and different moments, the same pattern surfaces. There is ordinary existence, and there is something else, something that most people, the people in the crowds, the people in the temples, the people going about their days in the full appearance of life, have not yet touched, which raises a question the verse forces directly into the open. If this condition is that widespread, if the living dead walk among us, indistinguishable from the awake, how exactly does a person know which category they belong to? Now return to the man standing in front of Jesus, because something is hiding inside his request that most readings completely overlook. He did not say he refused to follow. He said he would follow later, after he went back, after he completed what was waiting at home, after he fulfilled what the old life was asking of him. And then, only then, he would begin. On the surface, this seems not only reasonable but admirable. It seems like integrity. But what if Jesus saw the request differently? What if he looked at the delay and recognized it immediately, not as love, not as responsibility, but as the oldest mechanism of the sleeping mind? The mechanism that says yes, but not yet. The mechanism that keeps transformation permanently one step away. Always after this, always after the obligation is cleared, always once conditions are better, once things settle, once the moment finally feels right. The future is the favorite hiding place of the sleeping mind. And awakening, if it happens at all, only ever happens now, not later, not after, now. But this is where things become stranger still, because some ancient readings of this passage suggest that the Father himself may carry more symbolic weight than a literal parent. In the symbolic language that ran through much of the ancient world, the father represented inheritance, the old world, the accumulated past, the identity that was shaped before you were old enough to choose it. The beliefs, the fears, the obligations, the story of who you are that was written by others and handed to you as though it were simply the truth. What if the burial of the father was not just a practical task? What if it represented the pull of the entire old self, the entire inherited, unexamined life, calling a person back into its gravity? What if the man was not asking for time to grieve? What if he was asking for permission to return to who he had always been? And what if Jesus, seeing this with unsettling clarity, simply refused to give it? For centuries, the teachings of awakening across every tradition have converged on a single uncomfortable point. Transformation is not an addition to the life that already exists. It is a disruption of it. It does not arrive gently, expanding what was already comfortable. It arrives as the death of something, the death of the false certainties, the death of the inherited identity that was never really chosen, the death of the story that kept a person exactly where they were, generation after generation, convinced that the life they were living was simply the way things are. Most people want the result of this process. Very few want the process itself. Because the process asks for something the sleeping self is not prepared to give. The greatest funeral is not the burial of a body. It is the burial of everything you were told you were, before you were ever asked. And so the verse that sounded like cruelty begins to look like something else entirely. Not a dismissal of grief, not a cold hierarchy of priorities, but a diagnosis, a precise and unflinching description of what it looks like when a person stands at the edge of a genuine threshold and chooses in that moment to go back to sleep. The dead burying the dead, the sleeping guiding the sleeping, the unconscious shaping the unconscious, each generation handing to the next the same unexamined patterns, the same inherited fears, the same quietly closed doors, and calling it love, calling it tradition, calling it simply the way things are done, without anyone ever pausing long enough to ask whether any of it was ever truly chosen. The real tragedy was never physical death. The real tragedy is reaching the end of a life without ever having woken up inside it. What if this verse was never about a man on a road 2,000 years ago? What if it was always about the part of every person that is always about to begin, the part that is nearly ready, almost there, just waiting for one more condition to be met before the real life starts? How much of your life is actually yours? How much of what you believe, what you fear, what you protect, what you avoid, how much of it did you ever genuinely choose? And how much was simply inherited, absorbed before you were old enough to question it, worn so long it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the self? Maybe that is why this verse still disturbs people after 2,000 years, not because it is cruel, but because somewhere beneath the discomfort, something recognizes it. Something in us knows exactly what he was describing, because we have felt it. The pullback toward the familiar, the delay, the reasons that are always almost reasonable. And that recognition raises a question far more uncomfortable than anything about ancient texts. If the dead can walk, if they can speak and plan and grieve and love and move through entire lives without anyone, including themselves, noticing, how do you know you are awake?